Tonight's story is called The Snow Queen, the Garden That Waited Through Winter. A cozy story made just for you. Before we begin, let the day loosen its grip on you. There is nothing you need to remember tonight. Nothing you need to solve. Nothing you need to hold together. If your thoughts wander, let them wander. If sleep comes early, let it come without apology. This story will not ask you to keep up. Tonight's tale unfolds slowly, the way seasons do. Not all at once, but in quiet, patient movements. It's called The Snow Queen, the Garden That Waited Through Winter. And like all true gardens, it didn't bloom because it was hurried, but because it was remembered. There was once a silence that belonged only to the deep winter. Perhaps, as these words find you now, you can look out your window and see the world vanishing into a thick, swirling white, the roads and trees dissolving into a soft, monochromatic dream. Or perhaps you are sitting where the air is salt thick and warm, and the only winter you know is the one we create here together. It doesn't matter, for in the space between the voice and the ear, the world went quiet so that a story could begin. It was a time for pulling the blankets close. It was a time for letting the steam from a mug warm the vase. For we're leaving the present behind, traveling back beyond the reach of the calendar to a kingdom that lived in the gentle hush between the river and the hill. It was a place where mornings arrived slowly, the way light settles across a weathered garden stone, and evenings closed like a pair of folded hands in prayer. This was not a kingdom of cold marble or iron crowns. It was a kingdom of the earth. It was a realm of three friends, Kay, Leo, and Gerda. Three souls woven together by the shared language of the soil, the water, and the sun. Before the first winter chill ever learned the architecture of the window pane, there was the summer of ponds and gardens. In that season, life arrived in the slow, rhythmic pulse of growing things. To look upon the three was to see the very spirit of the earth in motion. They were not extraordinary by decree, but by the simple, holy way they lived. Doors were left open to the breeze, berries were shared from stained palms, and laughter rose through the air like warm breath on glass. Kay was the one with the restless spirit, a boy whose eyes were always searching the horizon. His hands were never still. They were always carving a piece of wood or skipping a stone across the pond. Leo was the quiet observer, the one who saw the miracles the others missed. He was the one who noticed the way the dragonfly's wing held a rainbow, or how the moss grew thickest on the side of the willow that faced the moon. And then there was Gerda, the heart of the three, possessing a stillness that was as deep as a well. She was the one who knew the secret names of the seeds, who could tell by the scent of the wind when the rain was exactly 3 hills away. They spent their hours tucked between rows of snapdragons that stood like colorful sentinels and sunflowers so tall that they seemed to be the very pillars holding up the sky. The air in that garden was thick, a heady perfume, a mix of crushed mint, some warmed marigolds, and the sharp herbal tang of tomato vines. The heat of the sun pressed against the back of their necks, and their fingers were stained a deep, permanent green from pinching the suckers away from the plants. When the thirst of the garden grew too great, they gathered around the garden hose. There was a specific joy in the shared coldness, the metallic taste of the water, the chaotic spray that turned the dust into their shins into a dark, wet pattern of mud, and the shared laughter that followed was bright and clear as a bell. Kay would hold the nozzle, spraying a mist that caught the light in the tiny prisms, while Leo and Gerda danced through the droplets, their summer clothes clinging to them like a second, cooler skin. When the July sun became a physical weight, the three retreated from the garden and followed the hidden paths to the creek bed. The path was a tunnel of cool, emerald light where the willow trees wept gracefully into the stream, their silver-green leaves brushing the surface of the water like a caress. There, the world was made of silt and shadow. The sensation of the silty mud squishing between toes was a dark, cool mercy against the baking day. They found the great limestone rocks, worn smooth by 1,000 years of wandering water, and sat in a row like three small silhouettes against the shimmering pond. Plink, the sound of the fishing line hitting the water, was the only clock they followed. They were not there for the catch. They were there for the stillness. Kay would watch the bobber with intense focus. Leo would track the ripples of the water striders, and Gerda would weave crowns of tall grass. They were together in the way that only those who truly love one another can be, without the need for words, satisfied simply by the simple presence of the other two. In the twilights, as the fireflies began their slow, flickering dance in the tall grass, they became architects of the small. They collected river stones that felt like cold silk in their palms, and built tiny moss-covered houses at the base of the ancient trees. They tucked acorn caps and blue jay feathers into the roots, creating a world that was as safe and enchanted as the bond they shared. And that summer, the air always smelled of damp earth and honeysuckle. They were sun-baked, mud-streaked, and certain that the warmth would last forever. They lived in the fullness of the light, heart whole, happy, and anchored to the earth and to one another. For a little while, before the shadows began to lengthen, before the first shard of ice found its way to the heart, the world felt whole. It was a kingdom of light, a gift given gently, as if entrusted rather than owned. The sun was still high, the water was still cool, and the three were still together, wrapped in the scent of summer rain, before the world learned how to freeze. The world remained golden for a long time, or so it seemed to those within the garden. But even the most beautiful stories have a shadow, and this shadow was born in a place where the air was too thin for breathing, and the stars hung like frozen needles in a black sky. Far above the valley, where the wind never ceased its mournful howling, there existed a mirror. It was not a mirror made of glass and silver, but of ancient, unyielding ice, the mirror of glacé. It had been forged in a forge of frost, intended to show the world not as it was, but as it could be made to look, ugly, small, and cold. In that mirror, the most beautiful forest looked like boiled spinach, and the kindest face looked like a gargoyle's mask. It was a mirror that stripped the soul of its warmth and left only the skeleton of things behind. One afternoon, as the three friends sat near the edge of the woods, the mirror shattered. It didn't break with a roar. It broke with a sound so high and sharp that only the birds could hear it. 1,000,000 shards, some no larger than a grain of dust, fell from the sky like a silent, invisible rain. Kay was the first to feel it. He was leaning over a patch of moss, showing Leo and Gerda a small, intricate carving he had made from a fallen willow branch. The sun was still high, and the water of the pond was still cool. Kay was laughing, his eyes bright with the shared joy of the afternoon, when suddenly he winced. "Ow!" he cried, pressing his hand to his face. "Something flew into my eye, and now something has pricked me here, in my chest." Gerda was by his side in an instant, her hands gentle as she tried to look into his eye. Leo stood nearby, his brow furrowed with a quiet concern, reaching out a hand to steady his friend. But there was nothing to see. The shard was too small for human sight, and it had already traveled deep. One piece had lodged in Kay's eye, and another, even smaller and sharper, had pierced his very heart. In that heartbeat, the world changed for Kay. He pulled away from Gerda's touch, his movements sudden and jarring. When he looked at her, the girl who had been his heart's anchor since they were small enough to hide in the tall grass, he didn't see the warmth in her eyes. He saw only a girl with a smudge of dirt on her nose and hair that looked like a bird's nest. "Why are you touching me?" he snapped, his voice sounding like the crack of thin ice. "And look at this carving. It's crooked. It's stupid. Why are we even sitting here in the dirt?" Leo stepped forward, his voice low, calming murmur. "Kay, it's just the sun. Let's go down in the water. The silt will feel good." But Kay turned his gaze onto Leo, and for the first time, he didn't see his brother of the earth. He saw a boy who was too slow, too quiet, and whose clothes smelled of pond water. "The pond is a muddy hole," Kay said, and the words felt like frost creeping over the garden. "The water is stagnant, and the fish are ugly, and I don't know why I ever liked it here." The three were still together, but for the first time, they were not one. Kay stood up and began to walk through the garden that they had tended so carefully. He saw the sunflowers, once the pillars of their kingdom, and saw only yellow weeds that were too tall and blocked the light. He saw the snapdragons, and he kicked them, laughing when the colorful heads snapped and fell into the mulch. Gerda began to cry, the tears hot and fast, but to Kay, her weeping sounded like the squeaking of a rusty hinge. Leo watched in a stunned, heavy silence, his grounded spirit unable to find a footing in his new, jagged world. The sun was still high, but to Kay, it was a pale, mocking eye. The water was still cool, but to Kay, it was a bitter, grasping thing. He left them standing there, Gerda with her broken flowers, and Leo with his heavy heart, and walked toward the edge of the garden where the shadows were longest. He began to mimic the way the old men in the village walked, mocking their limps and their quiet prayers. He found a strange, cold pleasure in pointing out the flaws in everything. The crack in the garden wall, the way the bread was too dry, the way the wind sounded like a dying animal. The summer of ponds and gardens had not ended, but for Kay, the ice had already arrived. He was no longer the boy who carved willow branches. He was the boy who saw only the wood, never the bird hidden inside. And as the first real frost of the year began to gather on the rose bushes that night, Kay sat by his window and stared out into the dark. He wasn't looking for fireflies. He was watching for the wind to bring him something colder, something sharper, something that matched the silver shard now resting against his heart. And far away, in the white silence of the north, the Snow Queen felt the snap of the ice. She turned her sleigh toward the valley, her eyes as pale as the winter moon, and began the long journey toward the boy who had already learned how to freeze. The autumn that followed the shattering of the mirror was a season of long, deepening shadows. The gold of the maples turned to a brittle brown, and the wind began to carry a sharp, metallic edge that tasted of iron and distant snow. In the garden, the sunflowers bowed their heavy heads as if in mourning, and the creek bed, once the sanctuary of the three, grew quiet and skeletal. Kay, Leo, and Gerda were still together, but the air between them had grown thin and cold. Kay no longer looked for the rainbow in the dragonfly's wing. He spoke only of the mechanics of flight. He no longer felt the silt between his toes. He spoke only of the dirt in the water. Then came the night when the first true storm arrived. It wasn't a storm of rain or thunder, but a storm of white silence. The flakes fell large and heavy, like the feathers of a great pale bird. In the village, families huddled close to their hearths, the firelight dancing against the walls. But Kay stood by the window, his forehead pressed against the freezing pane. Through the swirling white, a shape began to form. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a drift of snow caught in a whirlwind. But as it drew closer, the outlines of a great white sleigh emerged. It was pulled by a team of stag whose coats were as white as the frost, and their antlers glittered like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Seated in the sleigh was a woman. She was draped in a cloak of white fur that seemed to be made of 1,000,000 fallen flakes, and her crown was a jagged circle of ice that caught a pale light of the moon. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a high mountain peak, luminous, breathtaking, and utterly indifferent to the life below. She looked up at the window where Kay stood, and she smiled. It was not a smile of warmth, but a smile of recognition. She saw the shard in his eye, and she felt the ice against his heart. To her, he was a piece of her own kingdom that had wandered too far south. Without a word, Kay stepped out into the night. He didn't call for Gerda, and he didn't look for Leo. He walked toward the gate, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, his breath blooming in the air like white ghosts. The Snow Queen reached out her hand. Her skin was as pale as marble, and when Kay took it, he didn't flinch at the cold. To him, it felt like the only true thing in a world of a messy, fading warmth. "You are cold," she whispered, her voice sounding like the hum of a distant glacier. "But I can give you a world where the cold is a palace. I can give you a world where nothing changes, nothing wilts, and nothing hurts." She lifted him high into the sleigh and wrapped her heavy fur cloak around his shoulders, and as she did, she pressed a kiss to his forehead. It was a kiss that tasted of winter mint and deep sleep. In that moment, the memory of the garden faded. The smell of the tomatoes, the sound of Leo's laughter, and the steady warm heart of Gerda were wiped away like breath on a window pane. Kay looked back at the house one last time, but he didn't recognize it. He only saw a dark box in a white field. The queen snapped the reins, and the stags leapt into the sky. They flew over the village, over the frozen pond, and over the woods where the three had once built their moss houses. They flew north, toward the land of the midnight sun, where the shadows never end, and the heart forgets how to beat. Inside the house, Gerda and Leo woke to a world that was perfectly white and perfectly empty. The third chair at the table was cold. The sun was no longer high. The water was no longer cool. And for the first time in their lives, the three were no longer together. The morning that followed the great white storm was a morning of terrible, shimmering clarity. The sun rose cold and pale, a lemon-colored light that offered no warmth to the valley. Every branch of the willow tree was encased in a sleeve of ice, and the garden where the three had lived was nothing but a field of smooth, unblemished mounds. Gerda and Leo stood in the center of that silence. They looked for Kay's boot prints, but the wind had already swept the world clean, as if trying to erase the very memory of his departure. And the house felt different. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of bread and music of three voices, was now a place of long, echoing shadows. The third chair at the table stayed tucked in, its wooden back looking skeletal and stiff. They waited for the sound of his laughter, for the frantic scraping of his wood-carving knife, but the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock, marking a time that Kay was no longer a part of. Gerda sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the place where Kay had once sat. To her, the pain was sharp, physical thing, like a thorn pressed against her ribs. She remembered the smell of the garden and the way Kay's eyes used to catch the light. She didn't want to numb the ache. She wanted to follow it until it led her back to him. Leo stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. Being the observer, he felt the absence differently. To Leo, the world felt out of balance, as if a vital piece of the Earth's machinery had been removed. He understood, in his quiet way, that Kay had not just been taken. He had chosen to step into the white. He saw the way Kay had been looking at the horizon for weeks, as if the beauty of their pond and their garden had become a cage rather than a kingdom. He went to the place where the light doesn't reach, Leo said, his voice low and grounded, though it trembled slightly. He went looking for a world that doesn't hurt. But he doesn't realize that a world without pain is a world without us. They didn't have a map, and they didn't have a plan. They only had a memory of the warmth and the certainty that they could not remain in the garden while the third was lost in the frost. Gerda stood and wrapped herself in her heaviest wool cloak, the color of a deep winter red. She put on her thickest boots, the ones that had walked the muddy creek bed 1,000 times. She looked at Leo, and without a word, he reached for his own coat and his walking stick made of seasoned ash. "We'll follow the river," Gerda said, and her voice carried the weight of the vow. "The water was always our friend. It knows the way to the sea, and the sea knows the way to the ice." They stepped out of the house into the biting cold. The garden gate creaked on its hinges, a lonely sound that seemed to say, "Goodbye." They walked past the frozen pond, where the silt was now buried deep beneath the ice, and past the willow trees that stood like silent mourners. As they crossed the threshold of the valley, the world began to grow larger and stranger. The familiar hills melted away, replaced by dark forest of pine that seemed to whisper in a language made of needles and wind. There were two now, walking where there had always been three. The sun was no longer high. It was a dying ember on the edge of the world. The water was no longer cool. It was a hard, unforgiving surface. And yet, as they walked, Gerda and Leo held to the memory of the summer as if it were a torch. They spoke Kay's name into the wind, hoping it would travel north and find the boy who had forgotten his own heart. They didn't know how long the journey would take, or what guardians they would meet in the dark woods ahead. They only knew that the circle of the three could not be broken by a mirror of ice, not while there was still breath in their lungs and a garden waiting to bloom again in the spring. The road they followed was long, and the wind was sharp, a blade that never seemed tired of cutting through their wool. But as Gerda and Leo reached the edge of the dark pine forest, the air began to change. The scent of frost and iron drifted away, replaced by a smell so sweet and thick it felt like a weight in the lungs. The smell of lilies, roses, and sun-drenched jasmine. There, nestled in a valley that the winter had forgotten, stood a small cottage with windows that shone like liquid gold. The roof was made of thatch, so thick that it looked like the fur of a sleeping animal, and the walls were painted with flowers that seemed to move when the eye wasn't looking directly at them. As they approached the gate, the old woman stepped out. Her hat was painted with every flower imaginable, and her smile was as wide and inviting as a summer afternoon. She didn't look like a witch of legend. She looked like a grandmother who had spent her entire life tending to things that grow. "Come in, dear children," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over warm stones. "You look so weary. You look as though you've had been carrying a weight of the world on your shoulders. Leave your boots at the door. Leave your sorrows on the path. There's no winter here." Leo and Gerda stepped across the threshold, and the moment they did, the ache in their bones vanished. Inside the cottage, the air was always 4 o'clock, that golden, hazy hour when the bees are sleepy and the shadows are soft. The woman gave them bowls of cherries that tasted like concentrated sunlight and cake that melted on the tongue like sweet mist. As they ate, she combed their hair with comb made of sandalwood. With every stroke of the comb, the memory of the journey faded. With every bite of the fruit, the image of Kay grew dim. They forgot about the shard of ice. They forgot about the snow queen's sleigh. They even began to forget the summer of ponds and gardens. For why should one remember a garden that was gone when they were standing in one that never ended? For days, or perhaps it was weeks, for time had no meaning in this cottage. Gerda and Leo played in the woman's garden. It was a place of impossible beauty. There were flowers from every corner of the earth, blooming all at once. There were blue poppies that whispered secrets and red roses that smelled like deep velvet. Leo sat by a fountain that spilled crystal clear water, watching the goldfish swim in endless shimmering circles. He found himself drifting into a quiet, peaceful state where he no longer felt the need to observe the world. He only wanted to be a part of the blur. Gerda wandered among the lilies, her heart feeling light and hollow, like a bird's bone. The pain that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a pleasant, heavy warmth. They were safe, they were fed, and they were warm. But the memory of the earth is a stubborn thing. And one afternoon, while the old woman slept in her rocking chair, Gerda sat near a patch of earth where the woman had tried to hide the roses. The woman had buried them deep beneath the soil because she knew that roses always reminded people of the world outside, of the thorns that protect and the seasons that pass. A single tear from Gerda's eye fell onto the dark dirt. It was a tear she didn't even know she was crying, a small, salt-heavy remnant of a heart that refused to be completely numb. The tear soaked into the ground, and where it touched, a rose bush shot upward, blooming in an instant. The scent hit Gerda like a physical blow. It was the smell of their garden. It was the smell of the marigolds that they had pinched together. It was the smell of the sun on Kay's neck. "Leo," she cried, her voice breaking the golden spell of the cottage. "Leo, look!" Leo looked up from the fountain, and his eyes met the deep red of the rose. The fog in his mind cleared. He remembered the plink of the fishing line. He remembered the silty mud. He remembered the boy who was lost in the cold because he had tried to numb himself just as they were doing now. "We have stayed too long," Leo said, his voice regaining its grounding strength. "The beauty here is a lie, because it never dies. And if it never dies, it never truly lives." They didn't say goodbye to the woman of the perpetual summer. They did not take any more of her cherries. They grabbed their cloaks and their walking sticks and ran toward the gate. As they stepped out of the valley, the cold hit them with a ferocity that made them gasp. The sky was gray, the wind was howling, and the pine needles were sharp. But as they looked at one another, their faces were bright with a terrible, beautiful purpose. The sun was hidden behind the clouds. The water was frozen solid. But the two were together again, and in their memories, and for the first time since they had left home, they knew exactly where they were going. The road beyond the Garden of Forgetfulness was a jagged path of stone and shadow. Gerda and Leo walked until their boots were thin and their breaths came in short, frost-bitten gasps. The forest here was not made of gentle willows. It was a forest of iron oaks and thorns that clutched at their wool cloaks like desperate fingers. It was the deepest part of this thicket that the darkness began to move. Suddenly, the woods were alive with the orange flare of torches and the harsh, rhythmic clatter of steel. They were surrounded not by spirits, but by people who had become as wild as their briars. The robbers carried knives that glinted like the frozen pond, and their laughter was a jagged sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Gerda and Leo were led deep into a cavern that smelled of wood smoke, wet fur, and roasted meat. And at the heart of the cave, sitting on a throne of mismatched saddles, was the robber girl. She was a creature of fire and grit. Her hair was a tangled thicket of black curls, and she carried a dagger tucked into her belt as if it were a part of her own body. Her eyes were bright and restless, eyes that had seen too much of the world's coldness and had decided to strike back. "What have we here?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the damp stone hall. "Two little birds far from their nest. Do you have gold? Do you have secrets?" Leo stood tall, his ash walking stick planted firmly in the dirt. "We have a friend," he said, his voice grounded and steady even in the face of the knives. "He is lost in the north, in the palace of the Snow Queen. We are the only ones who remember his name." The robber girl paused, her hand hovering over the hilt of her blade. She looked at Gerda's red cloak and Leo's weathered boots. For a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps a memory of a time before the caves, crossed her face, but she hardened her expression quickly. "Everyone is lost," she snapped. "But in my cave, at least you are safe from the wind. Come, I will show you my treasures." She led them to a corner of the cavern where the walls were lined with cages made of twisted iron. Inside were dozens of wood pigeons, their feathers dull and their eyes wide in a quiet, persistent fear. And tied to a heavy stone ring was a reindeer, his coat the color of wood ash, and his antlers scarred by the ropes. "These are mine," the robber girl said, and there was a strange possessive hunger in her voice. "I keep them so I'm never alone. I keep them so they can never leave me for the cold." Gerda looked at the reindeer, and she saw in his eyes the same look she had seen in Kai's before he left. It was the look of a spirit that had been told that safety was better than freedom, that numbness was a fair trade for a cage. That night, they slept on the cold stone floor. The robber girl insisted on sleeping between them, her arm thrown over Gerda as if she were another bird to keep in a cage. But as the fire died down to the glowing embers, Gerda whispered to the wood pigeons. She told them of the sunflowers that were pillars in the sky. She told them of the silt between toes and the blink of the fishing line. The reindeer shifted his weight, his hooves clicking against the stone. "I know the north," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that felt like the earth moving. "I have seen the white sleigh. I have seen the boy whose heart is turning to glass. He sits in the hall of distant reason, trying to solve a puzzle of ice that has no answer." In the gray light of the morning, the robber girl awoke. She had heard the whispers. She had seen the way Gerda held the memory of her friend like a warm coal. For a long time, she looked at her knife, then at the cages. She was a girl who had built a kingdom of stone because she was afraid of the garden's wilting. She had closed herself off, just as Kay had, trying to numb the pain of being alone by owning everything around her. But the courage of the two, The way they walked toward the cold instead of hiding from it pierced her. "Go," she said, her voice rough and sudden. She sliced through the ropes that bound the reindeer. She flung open the doors to the pigeon cages. "Take the beast. He knows the paths where the stars touch the snow. If you stay here, you will only become like me, caged by your own fear." She gave Gerda a pair of fur-lined mittens and gave Leo a heavy knife of his own. As they mounted the reindeer, the robber girl stood at the mouth of the cave, looking smaller than she had the night before. "Don't come back," she called out. Through her eyes shone with a fierce, lonely pride. "Go find your boy. Tell him that the world is a dangerous, bleeding thing. But it's better to be a bird in the wind than a bird in the box." The reindeer leapt forward, his hooves finding purchase on the frozen trail. The wind began to howl once more, and the air turned a blinding, brilliant white. The sun was gone. The water was a memory. But the three, the two on the deer and the one in the ice, were drawing closer with every beat of the reindeer's heart. The reindeer ran as if the wind itself were at his heels. Across the jagged iron woods they flew, until the trees stunted and shrank, eventually vanishing altogether. The world became a vast, flat expanse of white, the tundra, where the earth and the sky met in a line so sharp it felt like a razor's edge. In this place, the cold was not just a temperature, it was a living presence. It sought out the gaps in their cloaks. It settled into the marrow of their bones. The sun was no more than a pale ghost, a smudge of light that offered no direction and no hope. Gerda and Leo clung to the back of the reindeer, their hands tucked into the fur-lined mittens of the robber girl had given to them. They did not speak. In the great white silence, words felt too heavy to carry, and breath was too precious to waste. As they pushed further north, the north began to push back. This is the danger of the deep cold. It doesn't just freeze the skin, it tries to freeze the memory. The vast, unchanging whiteness began to work a strange magic on their minds. Leo felt it first. He looked down at his hands, for a second, struggled to remember the feel of the garden trowel. He looked at the horizon and could not quite recall the specific shade of green the willow trees wore in August. The north was whispering to them, a low, hypnotic hum in the wind. "It is easier to let it go," the wind sighed. "It is simpler to be like the snow, perfect, quiet, and empty of the messy pain of longing. Forget the pond, forget the garden, forget the boy who left you." But Leo tightened his grip on his ash walking stick. He reached back into the archives of his heart and pulled out a single image, Kay's face, not as the ice had made it, but as it was when they were knee-deep in the creek. He held onto the name Kay as if it were a warm stone in a blizzard. "He is more than the frost," Leo whispered in the reindeer's ear, the words cackling in the frozen air. "He is the boy who carves willow. He is the one who skips stones. I remember him." Gerda, too, fought the numbness. She remembered the smell of the lilies from the cottage of forgetfulness and rejected it. She wanted the smell of the dirt. She wanted the sting of the thorns. She knew that to forget the pain of the search was to forget the love that had started it. Finally, the reindeer halted. There, rising out of the snow like a jagged tooth, stood the palace of the Snow Queen. It was built of 1,000 frozen drifts, its walls shaped by the hollowing winds. The windows were slabs of clear, black ice, and the great hall was so vast that 100 carriage teams could have driven through it without touching the sides. There was no fire in this palace. There was no kitchen. There was no garden. It was a monument to logic, cold, calculated, and perfectly still. The northern lights danced above the towers in ribbons of eerie green and violet, casting a light that showed everything but warmed nothing. At the very center of the hall, on the frozen surface of a lake that the queen had called the Mirror of Reason, sat Kay. He was blue with cold, almost translucent, but he didn't feel it. He was hunched over hundreds of flat, sharp pieces of ice, trying to arrange them in a single word. The queen had told him that if he could solve the puzzle, if he could find the absolute word, he would be his own master, and she would give him the whole world and a pair of new skates. He looked like a king, but he sat like a ghost. He was so focused on the fragments in front of him that he had forgotten the world that had actually loved him. He was trying to find a perfection that didn't exist, closing himself off to the beauty that had once been his. Leo and Gerda stepped off of the reindeer and stood at the threshold of the great hall. The air was so cold it seemed to shatter with every step they took. They looked at the boy that they had traveled 1,000 miles to find, the boy that the world had forgotten, the boy whose soul they had carried in their pockets like a secret. The Snow Queen was not there. She was away, painting the mountaintops with white and checking the frozen seas. The children were alone in the palace of ice. "Kay," Gerda whispered, and the name hung in the air like a tiny flame. Kay did not look up. He was searching for a piece of ice that would fit into the corner of his puzzle. He was lost in the dark of the world, trying to numb out the pain of another life, not realizing that the two people who knew his true name were standing right before him. The great hall of the Snow Queen was a place where breath turned to frost before it could leave the lips. There were no walls of stone here, only columns of driving snow and windows of black, unyielding ice. At the very center of this hollow cathedral lay a frozen lake, cracked into 1,000 jagged lines. And there was Kay. He was sitting in the middle of the vast blue ice, looking smaller than he had ever looked in the garden. He was blue with cold, his skin almost the color of a winter bruise. But he didn't feel it. He was hunched over, his shoulders tight, moving flat shards of ice around as if they were the most important things in the universe. He was trying to spell a word. The queen had promised him that if he could arrange the ice to spell eternity, he would be his own master. But the shards were sharp and wouldn't fit. They cut his fingers, but no blood flowed, for his heart was too cold to pump it. Gerda and Leo stepped onto the ice. The sound of their boots echoed through the hall like a heartbeat in a tomb. They walked toward the boy who had once been the third part of their circle. "Kay," Gerda called out. Her voice was small, but in that silent palace it sounded like a bell. Kay did not look up. He was staring at a jagged piece of ice that refused to slide into place. He was so lost in the logic of the queen, so focused on the image of the world he was trying to build, that the real world had become invisible to him. He was looking at the ice, but what he was seeing was nothing. Leo stepped closer, his ash walking stick clicking against the frozen lake. He looked at Kay, at the hollowed-out version of his friend, and he remembered the trial hearings of the soul. He saw the image of Kay, who he had become, and the one the queen regaled as the master of reason, but Leo refused to see a stranger. "Kay," Leo said, and his voice was the voice of the earth itself, grounded heavy and true. "Kay, it's Leo and Gerda. We've come for the boy who carves willow. We've come for the one who knows how the silt feels between his toes." Kay blinked. For a second, the name Leo seemed to ripple through an ice in his chest, but the shard in his eye was too strong. He looked at them. His expression was blank, like a window with the shutters closed. "I have to finish the word," Kay whispered, and his voice sounded like the dry rustle of dead leaves. "If I finish the word, the cold won't hurt anymore. If I finish the word, everything will be perfect." Gerda couldn't bear it. She saw the boy she loved trying to solve a puzzle that had no heart. She ran to him and threw her arms around his cold, stiff neck. She wept, and her tears were not the cold tears of the north, but the hot, salty tears of the garden. They fell onto Kay's chest. They soaked through his thin clothes and touched his skin. And because they were tears of love that refused to forget the soul, they melted the shard of ice against his heart. Kay shivered. A great racking sob broke from his chest, a sound of a world waking up to its own pain. And as he cried, he wept out the shard that was in his eye. The world rushed back in. He looked at Gerda, and he saw the deep red of her cloak. He looked at Leo, and he saw the strength of the boy who had walked through the dark to find him. He looked down at the shards of the ice in his hands and saw them for what they were, just cold, sharp pieces of nothing. "Gerda? Leo?" Kay whispered, and this time the breath was warm. "Where have we been? Why is it so cold?" He looked at the frozen lake, at the mirror of reason, and he remembered the pond. He remembered the sunflowers. He remembered the name Leo had carried for him when he could not carry it himself. The three were together again. The sun was not yet high, and the water was still frozen, but the ice inside the heart had finally begun to break. Leo reached out a hand and pulled Kay to his feet. "We're going home," he said. "The garden is waiting, and we have a lot of work to do to fix what winter has broken." The journey back from the edge of the world was not as fast as the journey there. There were no magic sleighs to carry them, and the north did not give up its grip easily. But as the three friends walked south, the ice began to soften beneath their boots. The air went sharp and iron cold, began to carry the faint, sweet scent of thawing pine and sleeping earth. They traveled past the cave of the robber girl, but the entrance was quiet. Only a single wood pigeon circled overhead, a silver streak against the gray sky. They passed the cottage of the perpetual summer, but they did not stop for cherries. They had no need for a world that never changed, for they had learned that the beauty of the garden lived in its willingness to die and be born again. When they finally reached the hills of their own valley, the sun was beginning to climb higher in the sky. The snow was retreating, leaving behind patches of dark, wet soil that smelled of old leaves and new possibilities. They reached the garden gate, the place where the was met the now. The sunflowers were gone, their stalks brown and bent, and the snapdragons were nothing but skeletons in the mulch. The garden looked like ruin, a map of everything the winter had taken. But as Leo, Gerda, and Kay stood at the edge of the rose, they did not see tragedy. They saw a beginning. Kay knelt in the dirt. He did not wince at the mud, and he didn't look for logic in the weeds. He reached out a hand and touched the cold, damp earth, the same earth that had once stained his knees. "It's still here," he whispered, and his voice carried a wonder that was deeper than the boy who had left. "It's waiting for us." The mending didn't happen in a single afternoon. It was slow, a rhythmic ceremony of the spring. They spent their days clearing the wreckage of the winter. Kay used his carving knife not to solve puzzles of ice, but to prune the dead wood from the willow trees, making space for the new silver-green buds to breathe. Gerda sifted through the soil, finding the hidden seas that had survived the deep freeze, her hands moving with a steady, quiet devotion. And Leo was the anchor. He carried the heavy stones to build the wall that the frost had cracked. He watched over the two, his quiet observation now a shield of protection. He knew that Kay's heart was still tender, like a new shoot in late frost. and he knew that Gerda's strength was the water that kept them all alive. They found their way back to the creek bed. The silt was back, squishing between their toes as they waded through the shallows. The water was cool. The plink of the fishing line returned to the air, and the three were together once more. The world was not the same as it had been before the mirror shattered. They carried the memory of the cold in the way that they tended the roses. They knew now that the garden was fragile, and that the warmth was a gift given gently, as if entrusted rather than owned. But as the July sun rose high once more, the kingdom felt whole. It was a kingdom of three, not of children who didn't know the winter, but of friends who had walked through it and remembered one another's names in the dark. The sun is high, the water is cool, and the three are together. Tonight, we close the chapter of this garden, and we open the quiet, holy one meant just for you. And so, dreamer, this retelling ends in a way that the truest stories always do. Not in a world where winter never comes, but in a heart that refuses to stay frozen. Grace is not always a miracle of light. Sometimes it's the slow, muddy work of mending a garden after a long storm. It's the courage to walk toward the cold, not to become it, but to find the soul hidden beneath the ice. If you ever feel the shadows lengthening, or the world tries to offer you a perfect silence in exchange for your heart, think of the three. Think of the one who was lost, the one who sought, and the one who remembered. Think of the silt, the sunflowers, and the name that was carried for you when you could not carry it yourself. The garden is calm now. The willows are whispering in the summer breeze. The air is warm with the scent of mended things, and the love that brought them home is here with you as well, resting over your heart like a blessing that you don't have to earn. Rest now. Let the night carry what you no longer need to hold. Good night from the garden, from the creek bed, and from the three who found their way back to the sun. Sleep now. You are safe. You are held. And you are loved. You've been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, written by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.